A big YouTube channel with 2.3 million subscribers called What I've Learned, run by Joseph Everett, put out a video recently about salt. He mostly does videos that are heavily researched, well presented, and maybe rethink some things that I previously believed. However, what I found during the process of making this video was not a different perspective, but something that was outright evil. Alright, I'm just going to be honest with you. This video has been sitting on my computer for about 5 months. I've had it recorded, edited most of the way through. I just got busy, got lazy, and really just put it on the back burner for about 5 months. So I just sat down, tried to do whatever bare minimum editing I need to do to get it to go up on YouTube, and that's what you're going to see. I think the content is good. The editing's not going to be anything special, but I think the whole thing was really interesting. At least it was interesting to me while I was researching, writing, and recording this video. But yeah, with that out of the way, enjoy. I put out a video some time ago with the same subject, and I was curious. I've seen some of those videos before, and I found it to be interesting and thought-provoking. Really able to give myself a new perspective on things. But this video felt a little off, and it might take a bit to explain why, but when we get there, it'll be very obvious. Let's take a step back though, because there's a lot of organizations that push a low-salt diet, usually recommending between 2,300 and 1,500 grams of sodium. I remember when I was looking into this number, it was because some people are genetically unable to handle high salt, making a low-salt diet almost necessary for these people. The other challenge coupled with this is that it's hard to figure out who is susceptible to salt and who isn't. I figured this video might show some nuance for people that are not salt sensitive and might benefit from a high salt diet. I'll break down the different points he makes, the sources he uses, and the manipulation in this video. Okay, so I'm gonna go back and forth between saying sodium and salt a lot, and you might see some graphs and tables. I'll say MEQ. To kind of simplify some of the language, when I say a gram of salt, salt is sodium chloride, with sodium being about 388 milligrams per gram of salt. And when I say sodium in milligrams, it's usually in that specific salt category. So it can feel like the numbers are always like a little off or a little weird when I say salt and sodium, but just keep in mind there's like a certain ratio, and most of the numbers kind of fall equally if you do the conversion. Now MEQ is more of a scientific way of measuring things. I'm not super sure on how this works, but 1 MEQ of sodium is about 23 milligrams. I won't do the conversion on the fly, but just keep these numbers in mind in your back pocket.
To prove that low salt is a scam, I ate an entire salt shaker of salt in one day.
He starts the video with doing an experiment on himself, consuming 60 grams of salt over the course of a day while drinking 5 liters of water.
I put this 60 grams of salt in about 5 liters of water and drank it throughout the day while checking my blood pressure. By the way, definitely do not try this at home. People have died from consuming less than 60 grams of salt all at once. I lived because I drank it slowly over a day.
And throughout the day, there was basically no change in his blood pressure at all.
I checked my blood pressure 5 times throughout the day while eating tons of salt, around 10 to 15 grams between each blood pressure check. Remember, the WHO's limit for salt for an entire day is only 5 grams. I finished a total of 63.5 grams of salt by 10 p.m. My blood pressure started out at 114 over 66 and ended up at 113 over 61 before I went to bed.
However, when he had a Monster Energy drink, his blood pressure shot right up.
On another morning, I checked my blood pressure before and after having a Monster Energy drink. Within just an hour, the Monster took my blood pressure from 108 over 66 all the way to 125 over 71.
This is actually something that surprised me a little bit. Like, I didn't know a regular person could consume that much salt and be fine. But I guess it makes sense as long as you have it slowly and drink enough water to pee it out. And 5 liters of water is equal to about 1.1 gallons, which is more than enough water to flush basically anything out of your body. The Monster Energy drink part is pretty simple though. Caffeine is a stimulant, gives you a higher heart rate, which gives you a higher blood pressure. The main point of this segment was to show that sodium, when taken at the extreme, wouldn't raise your blood pressure, which kind of demonstrates it. I feel like doing it just for one day might not get the results you'd want to see, but I'll give it a pass. It's a good intro, a good hook, and after all, a good story sells.
The year is 1977, a big year for America. That year is when the famous dietary goals for the United States were being crafted by George McGovern.
Joseph pins the start of the low-salt diet in 1977, where a lot of health guidelines were being made and the dreaded food pyramid was designed. Now, he mentions 2 big things about this report. They recommended cutting saturated fat and cutting salt.
Tell Americans to cut salt and saturated fat.
For some reason, he decides not to mention that they cut out removing sugar as well, but we'll get into that more later. Now we're going to go to his Substack where he gets more specific about these claims. He states, these goals recommended to reduce saturated fat all the way down to 10% of the diet and increasing carbohydrate to as much as 60% of the diet. He'll also cite Dr. Robert Olson, who says,
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Now, what does this report actually go over and actually say? First, however, let's understand why this report was being made. It's the late 1970s. Technology and our advancements in health has made life easier as well as living longer. Up to this point in history, most people were dying from infection and diseases. But leading into the 1970s, heart disease and cancer were topping the charts. So people in Congress wanted to act and do something, because sitting by and doing nothing seemed way worse. They looked at what current data they had and went with where it was trending, finding that Americans were eating a lot more sugar and saturated fat than they used to. The report would end up harping on these two main points primarily. Salt was mentioned, but doesn't seem as important as the others, mainly because it's also the last goal mentioned. Still important, but not the most pressing. Also mentioned is overconsumption in general, with the rise of obesity. The report is very aware how controversial it is, and professional disagreement is expected. The real hope is to use this as a starting point and update our understanding with more research down the line. Much like the Constitution, this will be a living document. Alright, let's get to the baseline macro recommendations. Increase carbs from 55% of our diet to 60% of our diet, and then reduce our fats from 40% of our diet to 30% of our diet? Wait, I thought he said 10% on a Substack, and the carb increase is barely that much if anything. Well, if you look closely at what he says saturated fat, not fat in general, which is an interesting pick. He'll cite all kinds of carb intake, but only cite one kind of fat intake. If I had to guess, he really wants to lean into the sugar versus MAD info, which was very popular during the time.
We've been told the science was settled on so many different things, only to learn later that we didn't get the full story.
Are all calories equally fattening? No.
Low fat is not necessarily better.
Eggs may be healthier than first thought.
By citing that ridiculously low number, to an average person not super educated on nutrition, could seem, well, ridiculous. But we're missing the bigger picture and we only focus in on these two things. As you can see here in the rest of the guidelines, reduce sugar to 15% from 24%, increase complex carb intake to 40 to 45% from 22%, as well as the micronutrient goals listed. This paints a very different picture from what Joseph was trying to present to us in his video and Substack. He made it seem like they were ignoring sugar and just demonizing fat, which is just false. While the carb recommendation did go up, for someone on a 2,000 calorie diet, that'd be about 100 calories. Which isn't nothing, to be fair, but not being transparent with us what numbers they're looking to change can feel a little misleading. Now in the video, he shows the recommendation is 3 grams, while saying aloud only 5 grams.
Well, the 1977 report included the recommendation to limit salt to just 5 grams per day, the same amount that the WHO still recommends today.
And I found that this discrepancy was for probably the dumbest reason. So what happened is the first report that I'm reading to you now, and that I've been showing you, after it was released, they had some discussion and some feedback given to them by experts, and they quickly put out a second version with the recommendations and updates, which is the one I'm assuming he read. I only know this because I had to go looking for the report myself, since he doesn't cite his sources anywhere in the description or give us an easy way to access them on a Substack. I came upon the second edition first thinking it was the correct one. I had a similar front page, the correct year, same talking points. It wasn't until I actually started reading it that I found out they kept talking about the second edition a lot, which made me think, is there another one before this that also came out in 1977 or before? Lo and behold, there was, and that seems to be where he got most of the graphics for the video. But it's also a little confusing because did he get his points from the second edition, but just the graphics from the first edition? Even though they're very similar, it feels hard to kind of figure out where he got his information about this report from. Did he read it directly, or did he hear someone else's secondhand account and just kind of use some of the first edition for just some photos for his video? This is just one thing that was really sloppy and I can excuse for now. But this raises a separate question though that he never really gets to in the video. Why was this change from 3 grams in the first report and 5 grams in the second report? Well, they say why, and I kind of mentioned it a little bit before. They had hearings, debates, discussions, and reports came in, and they updated all their guidelines based on that. The specific cited reason for the salt change is stated. Upon further review of the evidence concerning sodium intake, the select committee believes that while a 3 gram or even a 2 gram dietary goal for salt, sodium chloride, intake is probably justified for the high-risk population having hypertension, 5 grams a day is more appropriate level of salt intake to recommend at this time for the general population. The new report also states where it got its recommendation from.
But what was this recommendation based on?
Dr. Manili and Barterby. It's right there. We don't need to wonder how they came to this conclusion at all. It's literally in the report.
But what was this recommendation based on?
It's actually in both reports, the first and second edition.
But what was this recommendation based on?
So there really shouldn't be any confusion from Joseph as to where this number came from. You can also pause the video at 3:24 and see it right there on screen if you decide to pause and read it.
But what was this recommendation based on?
But in Joseph's Substack, he knows this. He explains who they are and how it comes from them. And yeah, I'll agree. There is no study. It's just expert opinion, and they find that adequate salt intake is somewhere between 0.6 and 3.6 grams. They also believe strongly that potassium and genetics have a big part in your blood pressure. Also something Joseph is aware of, but doesn't really mention, and only mentions one time in the video.
Their position was that high sodium, in the context of low potassium, could cause hypertension in people who were genetically susceptible. The committee report didn't end up mentioning anything about potassium or genetics though. They just said to cut your salt intake.
At this point, he's actually just lying. He hasn't read the report and has no idea what's in it. They do mention potassium in both, on the first page of the sodium section on both as well.
The committee report didn't end up mentioning anything about potassium or genetics though.
Both also mention genetics playing a role, and they even go on to estimate that approximately 20% of people are genetically susceptible to salt.
The committee report didn't end up mentioning anything about potassium or genetics though.
And let me reiterate specifically. In his Substack, he says there's no mention of potassium or genetics in this report because the scientists said it'd be too complicated for Americans, which would have been a really good point if he wasn't literally talking about himself.
The committee report didn't end up mentioning anything about potassium or genetics though.
He's self-reporting his own ignorance and inability to read a few pages. Or he did read it as being malicious and just lied to all of us. Because the salt section is literally like 4 pages. You couldn't just skim it to make sure your claim was correct. You couldn't just type Control F potassium and see if it shows up in the document.
The committee report didn't end up mentioning anything about potassium or genetics though.
I have no problem with some skepticism and wanting more studies and rigorous methods to find out if this number is true and the best one we could have, but contend with what they're actually presenting you. For example, I would say the carb intake is particularly a little high. I'd probably go around 50%, give or take 5 or 10% from there. And I'd really like to bump up that protein intake and maybe reduce that fat intake or just kind of adjust it slightly. But these macro recommendations aren't too far outside what an average healthy person could be eating every day. He'll still end up asking the question of where this number came up in his video, but then ignores it for a moment to tell a story.
A March 1940 paper describes the case of a child who, starting from 11 months, had a very unusual craving for salt.
Before circling back and blaming Lewis Dahl for this recommendation.
The idea that salt causes high blood pressure gained popularity thanks to Dr. Lewis Dahl.
Dahl looked at hypertension across multiple populations and found those that had low sodium intake had lower hypertension rates, which Joseph accurately portrays, but hardcore mischaracterizes his rat study.
Dahl found some data suggesting that populations who ate more salt seemed to have more hypertension, and then he began studying the effects of high salt diets in rodents.
First, stating that rats aren't human, which is obvious.
Now, not only were the rats in Dahl's experiments not humans,
although a lot of research is done on animals first, for better or for worse, but it feels like he's bringing it up as a why or how would you get any conclusions from studying rats. Now, Dahl did breed rats that were sensitive to salt specifically.
They were a special type of rat. In 1963, Dahl fed rats a high salt diet and found that some, but not all, developed high blood pressure. He then selectively bred the rats to create a strain of rats that were genetically extra sensitive to salt.
But he did this because he noticed that some people could have high salt diets and be fine, while others would develop hypertension, and he wanted to see how that would play out in rats, leading Dahl to believe that genetics played a big role in whether sodium can cause hypertension, which ended up being true. The video ignores this and is going to say we immediately controlled the amount of salt we put in baby food.
Later, in 1970, he fed the salt-sensitive rats commercial baby food, and about half of the salt-sensitive rats died. He assumed that the high salt content of the baby food was what killed the rats. After his study was published, the US Senate issued a mandate for lowering salt in baby foods,
which I could not find anywhere putting the link between the two. This would be nice to have some sources so I could check what he was saying and where he got this from. This is going to be the first study he grossly mischaracterizes, misuses, and doesn't even report the findings of the study, or how it actually helped us understand people with high blood pressure better. He'll go on to say that there was no study done on humans to see the relationship between salt and blood pressure until 1983.
In his book, The Salt Fix, Dr. James DiNicolantonio says that there wasn't even a single study investigating whether salt causes hypertension in humans until 1983.
Which is sort of true. There was a doctor in 1904 that showed a correlation between salt and high blood pressure, but that was only with 6 patients. Not really a good study or a study at all, really more just an observation. But it was the first step in noticing that something might be up. There was also a doctor that treated high blood pressure patients with a low salt diet. Still not a study, but there's something there. So there's some evidence that you can just randomly tie salt and blood pressure for no reason. Now when we get to the 1983 study, the one on screen isn't really a salt study.
6 years after they crafted the low salt dietary guidelines for Americans.
It says salt in the abstract there, but it's looking more at sugar than anything else. What I believe to be the actual salt study in 1983 says, these findings indicate that it is unlikely dietary salt intake has a clinically significant effect on blood pressure in the majority of individuals in a large defined population, that do not exclude the possibility of a clinically significant effect in a small subgroup of salt-sensitive individuals, which makes sense to me and the findings up to this point. Not to mention the 1977 report, it mentioned something similar with genetics. In my own salt video, I found that high salt for most people is pretty inconsequential, but can be for salt-sensitive people. It was also a little weird to bring up this study, show the wrong one on screen, and then not show the results for either one of them. I thought the whole point was that the guidelines were made, then research came out later contradicting it. And this study is later, why not tell us what they found? Even if this one study disagree with you, you can show others that supported you, maybe had stronger evidence, had a little more rigorous research, or maybe why the first one didn't hold up to any scientific standard that you'd like. There's a lot of options you could have here, but he doesn't really explore any of them. Stepping away from the video for a second and going back to his Substack, you can see the study he links. And it's the same one in the video, which is a little confusing because the study talks about different sugars and their effects on blood pressure, not really salt. I'm not really sure what to make of this, but it would be nice if we went into more details about some of these and talked about more of the conclusions they found. This will also be the last time I mention the Substack, because I want to get more, I'd have to pay, and I'm not paying him. Anyway, he'll look back at the rats and say, hey, those rats basically had 40 grams of salt, and the non-salt sensitive ones had 100 grams.
Jordan Filkall explained that the human equivalent dose necessary to give the salt-sensitive rats high blood pressure in Lewis Dahl's experiments was 40 grams. That is 4.7 times what the average modern American actually eats today, 8.5 grams per day. Remember, this is in the salt-sensitive rats. In fact, the human equivalent of what the salt-resistant rats were eating was way higher than my salt shaker of salt in a day experiment, which was 60 grams. The salt-resistant rats could eat the human equivalent of 100 grams of salt a day and still not get high blood pressure.
What I assume he's trying to make with this is that if rats are able to consume this much safely, proportional to humans, why are we making recommendations for human food based on that? And let's be clear, I haven't found any evidence that Lewis Dahl's rat studies have influenced sodium guidelines anywhere. And neither has he just says they have. I have no idea where this came from really. When I look into it, they did have an initiative to reduce salt in baby food, but where this comes from seems to be a different study in 1970. And at the time, there seemed to be some evidence pointing towards salt being a reason for hypertension, especially since cutting down your sodium intake was a primary medical treatment at the time. I'll also say, the rat experiment was just a way to reveal that genetics played a big role in hypertension, and salt recommendations from these guidelines came from what doctors observed to be relatively safe for humans, while also finding that our body doesn't need too much more than was already in our food. And there has been at least a loose tie between salt and hypertension since at least 1904. I want to quickly touch on the baby who ate a lot of salt. Now, from reading this story, he presents it pretty fairly.
It was estimated that the toddler was eating an extra teaspoon of plain table salt each day, in addition to his foods already being saltier than his parents. Based on weight, the adult equivalent of that would be around 20 to 30 grams of extra salt per day.
The kid had Addison's disease, which specifically messes with your sodium levels, managing to keep himself alive for a few years on a high salt diet, extremely high. Then when he went to the hospital, he was given a low salt diet, or just a lower salt diet in general. He would die.
His body was urging him what it needed to get. The parents became very worried about his condition and admitted him to the hospital at age 3. Unfortunately, after only 7 days on the hospital's low salt diet, he suddenly died. In the paper, they specifically wrote that it would seem that this boy, by increasing his salt intake, kept himself alive for 2.5 years.
It's a pretty tragic story. I just don't know why this story specifically was brought up. It could be that we intuitively know how much salt we need to live, or that salt is vital to life. Something he says after the story.
Salt has always been vital for life.
Or that high salt intake is actually safe. It's also one case of an extreme scenario in 1940 where someone died from not having enough salt. That'd be like me saying, hey, look at this person with a deficiency in a certain nutrient. They require higher amounts of that nutrient to live. When we give them a lot more of that thing, they're healthy. However, when you give them an average amount, they die. Kind of paints the picture that this nutrient is vital to life, which is true, but it doesn't mean you need a lot of it to live. If he's trying to go the route of we intuitively know how much salt we need, think of an addiction. No one intuitively knows how much of a drug, of smoking, of alcohol they need. They probably don't need any of those things, honestly, but they feel like they have some kind of hardwired thing in their brain to need it. So I don't think comparing someone who's deficient and needs a lot more of it and maybe has some kind of intuition that they might need more of it because they feel better when they do get more of it is the same as saying a regular person also does this in a healthy way. If Joseph gave us a healthy person who died from having too little sodium in his diet, that'd be a stronger point in direction, especially if it was given to him on a recommendation from a doctor or some trusted dietitian or medical professional. But hey, A good story sells. To further his point of salt being good, or at least not bad in higher quantities, he wants to go back to the 1500s, to the pinnacle of human health.
Let's rewind. We're back in the 1500s, and refrigerators didn't exist, so people preserved their food with salt. This meant that salt intake in particular regions of Europe was very high, around 40 to 100 grams, almost 2 salt shakers worth.
It's true back then that people consumed a lot of salt, correctly identified in his video as the only way to really preserve food at the time. The 1800s also saw a lot of sodium in their food, or at least in their military rations.
If you fast forward to the early 1800s until World War II, Western societies consumed 3 times the WHO's recommended limit of sodium, between 15 and 17 grams of salt per day, based on military archives data.
Since that's what's cited at 15 grams to 17 grams, with no real widespread blood pressure issues.
Yet, widespread high blood pressure is a totally recent phenomenon.
Which makes a lot of sense for a few reasons. One, people didn't really live that long anyway, so they never really had to deal with heart problems that much in the first place. We also weren't really able to measure blood pressure until about 1896. I'm not sure if this is an appeal to history or tradition where we were fine on a high salt diet then, so why can't we be now? Because we can go back even further to when we didn't add salt to our food at all and we were doing just as fine, if not maybe better in some ways. Or we could also look to remote tribes that don't add salt to their food and don't really seem to suffer from hypertension at all as well. We can go tit for tat on all these issues, but I don't think looking to history is like the best example of what we should look for human health. Because if I had to guess, no one really wants to have the diet of Europeans in the 1500s.
Take a look at the South Korean paradox. South Koreans eat a wide variety of salty foods, with the easiest example being kimchi, cabbage and other vegetables preserved in salt and spices. For many Koreans, kimchi is served at literally every meal. The average South Korean consumes around 4,000 milligrams of sodium per day, much more than the average American, and almost twice as much as the US dietary guidelines recommend.
Korean paradox. Koreans eat a lot of salt. It's in a lot of their food, and they consume about 4,000 milligrams of sodium daily. A lot more than Americans, but they do the best in the developed world on heart disease, while also being able to drop the rate of people dying from heart disease by 40% in 20 years.
Korea has the lowest rates of heart disease in the world. Further, despite no change in their food culture, Koreans' death rate from heart disease went down 40% from 2000 to 2019.
What's interesting is that the US did the same number in the same time span as Korea, with Americans actually consuming more sodium in this time frame as well. Now, just a guess, pure speculation here, the reduction of heart disease death on both ends probably has more to do with us being better at medically dealing with it, being drugs or other medical interventions. He'll then bring up a study and show a table that shows the group with the highest sodium consumption had the lowest risk of heart disease, hypertension, and stroke.
In fact, data from a September 2015 paper funded by the Korea Food Research Institute suggests that extra salt consumption might actually be protective against hypertension, heart disease, and stroke. The data shows that the quartile groups that consume the most sodium had the lowest rates of hypertension, coronary heart disease, and stroke. This has been dubbed the Korean paradox.
But the conclusion of the study he's citing disagrees with him, stating it was found that there is a positive correlation between sodium intake and prevalent rates of coronary heart disease, while potassium intake has a negative correlation with prevalent rates of hypertension and stroke. In order to control the effect of sodium on diseases, attention must also be paid to the influence of potassium on diseases as a covariant, and it is considered that additional research should be made regarding the role of potassium in studying the impact of sodium on health in the future. Also, Joseph never mentioned that the high sodium group had the lowest rate of heart disease, not because they had a lot of sodium, but because they had a lot of potassium in their diet. He just says that people that had low sodium diets were the reason they had high heart problems.
Tons of salt may be bad for you, but too little salt is likely much worse.
Alright, but this is a big tip for all of you, and for some reason Joseph as well. In researching and looking things up and reading studies, don't assume you know more than the people researching. Unless you're literally a PhD in that expertise of study. Just try and stick to the abstract, conclusion, or discussion section of the studies. Because someone like Joseph can really take control of the narrative and just kind of distort it and move it to whatever suits his needs the most, regardless of how true or accurate it really is. Now we circle back to the beginning of the video with this self-experiment to dive deeper on why that much salt didn't kill him. He uses a study that gave participants up to 87 grams of salt and they were fine. They didn't die.
So you might be curious why nothing happened when I ate that entire salt shaker of salt. Well, let's take a look at this study. In a 1979 study, they gave men with normal blood pressure more and more salt. They kept ramping up the salt until they reached as much as 87 grams of salt, about 1.5 salt shakers. This is about 50 15 times the amount of salt that the WHO recommends, and about 10 times what the average American actually consumes. What happened? Well, they just peed out almost all of the salt.
And this study did look at what extreme salt levels would do to someone. They found that the subjects were able to excrete all the sodium pretty quickly, but also noted the autonomic system plays a big role in regulating our sodium levels. And when that system doesn't work as intended, individuals can get high blood pressure from that. I wouldn't say he used this study wrong, but also doesn't prove that the long-term consumption of salt at this level is safe. The main argument he's trying to make here is that your body can deal with a lot of salt, but too little will kill it. Joseph cited a study that looked at sodium excretion and found that people that excreted 3 to 6 grams of sodium per day were least likely to have high blood pressure or major cardiac events.
Biology suggests that too little salt is much worse for the body. A 2014 study in the New England Journal of Medicine proved just that. They found that based on urine samples from over 100,000 people in 17 countries, if you actually consumed the WHO's recommendation of only 2,000 milligrams of sodium, you would have a higher risk of death from heart disease than if you ate the 3,400 milligrams of sodium that the average American actually eats. Funnily enough, to have the lowest risk of death from heart disease in that study, you'd have to eat about as much salt as the South Koreans, a little bit over 4,000 milligrams of sodium.
As well as the higher the potassium excreted, the lower the blood pressure and less major cardiac events. The study itself also mentioned that while the findings were valid, they believe that we should be careful when interpreting the data for a generalized population, mainly because they couldn't get a random sample. They cite that it wasn't really feasible to do so. And finally, they say, therefore, our findings should not be interpreted as evidence that the intended reduction of sodium intake would alter the risk of death or cardiovascular disease. Meaning if people were to switch from a high sodium diet to a low sodium diet, there wouldn't necessarily be any change in risk. Joseph's reading of the study was kind of fair, but he leaves out the big part that potassium plays in it, and that the study proved that low sodium was bad for your body, when this study didn't really go out to prove that.
2014 study in the New England Journal of Medicine proved just that.
It just looked at how much people were excreting sodium and potassium, and heart problems are associated with different levels. And all this is starting to make more sense with all the studies he shows. This 2014 study only captured how much people excreted, and not how much they consumed. It is possible to get an accurate assumption of how much you consume based on how much you excrete, but what it seems, in order to reduce your blood pressure, the sodium you excrete is essential. Going back to the Korean paradox study, they write that an increase in potassium helps you excrete more sodium. The 2014 study also found, to reiterate, increasing potassium excretion was associated with lower heart risk. All these pieces kind of come together and reveal that the problem could be not enough potassium in our diets. There's not a single study saying that lowering your sodium intake would be bad for you, especially for high-risk people. But almost all of these have said in some way, increasing your potassium intake would be good for you. But for some reason throughout this whole video, Joseph only says potassium 3 times, when I feel like it's a big part of every study and every segment he brings up, which kind of makes you wonder. We now move on to the last big claim of this video, that salt affects your hormones and stresses your body out on a low salt diet.
What you would feel the effects of very clearly are changes in hormones. You might think of, say, protein and vitamins having significant effects on hormones. For example, when it comes to boosting testosterone, things like vitamin D, magnesium, zinc, selenium, boron, and so on can help. Though I'll bet you don't think of salt as having a significant effect on hormones.
The study he uses really makes me laugh when I try and think about it.
A study in the journal Hypertension found that compared to people on a high salt diet, those on a low salt diet had twice the levels of 2 stress-related hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Simply put, a low-salt diet seems to be stressful for the body.
First, the subjects that are used in the study are insulin-resistant and salt-sensitive, which, if we go back, he didn't like when Dahl used salt-sensitive rats to make conclusions, but will use salt-sensitive humans to prove his point, which is whatever. Second, the point of this study wasn't to look at stress levels. This study looked at high and low salt diets and checked to see what their nocturnal fall in blood pressure was. Third, the hormone levels in the chart he shows are still within the normal range. So the study does mention that the changes in these levels are significant. They are by no means abnormal. Plus, it would make sense for them to go up if you look at the low salt group. You see their blood pressure fall at night, and epinephrine and norepinephrine is released into the body to increase their blood pressure again. It's not so much that the body is stressing out on low salt, it's more of the body trying to maintain a certain blood pressure and using those hormones to do that, which, to be clear, is my personal speculation. The study doesn't really talk or mention this, or really try and justify or explain why these hormones are going up exactly. And this study does not in any way back up what he's trying to say, that the body gets stressed when you have a low salt diet. This is by far the most egregious misuse and mischaracterization of a study he's done.
A 1936 paper got people to be sodium deficient through 7 days of sweating and sodium-free diets. The paper said that the participants reported that they experienced extreme unquenchable thirst. One participant reported that he experienced a longing for salt and often went to sleep thinking about it. With regard to mood-related symptoms, subjects reported a loss of appetite, anhedonia, difficulty concentrating, excessive fatigue, and a general sense of exhaustion.
It also used a study where scientists basically torture people and deprave them of salt. And honestly, those people didn't look so good. They really suffered, and I don't really doubt that. Keep in mind that they were intentionally made deficient in salt. Shouldn't be all that surprising that people who are used to and need salt in their diets, being forcibly deficient in them, wouldn't react all that well. So that's another little piece for the narrative, because after all, a good story sells. Where this whole hormone discussion gets interesting is in these next two studies he brings up.
In 2015, researchers out of the University of Manitoba published a review that lays out all the negative hormonal effects of low sodium diets. Low salt diets can have effects on all sorts of functions in the body, including blood sugar control, energy metabolism, heart disease risk, inflammation, and the hormones associated with kidney function. And a 2008 study published in the Journal of Physiology and Behavior found that individuals that work day to day in extremely hot environments losing copious amounts of sodium through sweating commonly complain of fatigue, headache, difficulty concentrating, and sleep disturbances, symptoms which are often associated with psychological depression.
The first one was a review of studies. It actually found that low sodium diets did negatively affect people. But the study found that it was difficult to interpret the data, and most of these studies were short-term, meaning 4 to 14 days, with them saying 6 months would be needed to see any long-term effects. They also found the restriction in some of these diets was very low, less than 1,500 milligrams in some of them, and are not really realistic for most populations. So more murky and unsure data results, but he'll just show the charts and graphs anyway, regardless of what all the scientists would say. The last one he presents really gets me though. It's a 2008 study, and he quotes it saying,
individuals that work day to day in extremely hot environments losing copious amounts of sodium through sweating commonly complain of fatigue, headache, difficulty concentrating, and sleep disturbances.
You know, I feel like I've seen a reference to this before. Where was it? Oh yeah, it was the 1977 report. Now, to be fair, it was only in the second edition, not the first. Nonetheless, it does talk about how if you're doing heavy work or sweating a lot, you would need more salt to compensate for that loss. And Joseph is probably quoting this more to show that low salt is physically and mentally damaging more than anything else, which is fair, but I really need to read the conclusion to you to show you why it's so funny he brought this study up in particular. One goal of the present review is to highlight potential mechanisms underlying excessive sodium intake following sodium depletion or restriction. Although a number of researchers have argued that we as a society are addicted to sodium, much of the data in support of this assertion is based on cross-cultural studies, anecdotes, and self-reports that have provided very little insight into the neural underpinnings of this abuse of sodium. Emerging evidence from animal studies suggests that sodium is similar to other natural reinforcers, e.g. sex, voluntary exercise, fats, carbohydrates, chocolate, in its possessing addictive qualities. There appears to be a significant overlap in the neural substrates involved in drug addiction and sodium appetite sensitization, and cross-sensitization has been demonstrated between sodium depletion and psychostimulant treatment. Rats depleted of sodium multiple times show a neurochemical profile similar to that following sensitization to drugs of abuse, and demonstrate a craving for sodium as exhibited by an increased breakpoint in a progressive fixed ratio operant task. These findings suggest that changes in sodium status can alter the chemistry and anatomy of putative reward pathways in the brain, the same pathways impacted by drugs of abuse and potentially involved in maintaining addiction. Basically saying that salt has a similar impact on our mind as other addictions might, whether it's something more natural or something more drug related. It is well known that for many people, salt enhances taste. Although for how such a strong preference for sodium develops is still under scrutiny, it is possible that our preference for sodium is a learned behavior. For example, newborn infants generally display an aversion or indifference to moderate levels of salt, and it is not until age 2 or 3 that they prefer salty tastes. Similar effects are observed in low salt intake groups following initial experience with high salt diets, suggesting that at any point during the lifespan, the introduction of a high salt diet induces an initial aversion and therefore requires a period of habituation. Our preference for sodium is often so compelling that patients with hypertension or CHF have difficulty adhering to a low sodium diet due to issues with palatability, e.g. food becomes bland and unappetizing, despite the recognized health benefits of doing so. I find this to be a little more scary. Our desire for a high salt diet isn't natural, and once acclimated to it, it's basically impossible to shake, even if you're told your life depends on it. This puts into question whether salt has become an addiction and hijacked our neurological pathways. But I would also like to say, there's probably more research that needs to be done on this. This isn't necessarily conclusive, it's just something they kind of noticed and saw in their studies and review of the literature. And when I look back, all these studies kind of convinced me of a few things just for doing research for this video. One is that most people, about 80%, could be fine having a high sodium diet and not face many consequences doing so. Two is that we really need more potassium in our diets. 3 If you have high blood pressure, lowering your sodium intake is an effective way at lowering it, especially for those that are salt sensitive. And finally, we as a society might be addicted to salt. And again, the last one is mostly speculation and can be argued whether that addiction is healthy or to a healthy extent. It also just seems really implausible for Joseph to come to the conclusions he has, especially if he actually did read any of these reports or studies at all. Because I mean, he could have easily angled it towards being a more potassium focused video and why you need more potassium in your diets, and why salt could be dangerous for a select few. For most people it's fine. It's really potassium we need to worry about. Getting to the end of the video was a big realization as to why he didn't do this.
If you're exercising a lot, in the sun, going to the sauna, doing a low carb diet, fasting, or doing things that's gonna make you sweat and lose more sodium, you'll have to be more proactive about your salt intake. This brings us to the sponsor of this video, Element.
This whole thing, this whole video was just a big ploy to sell more Element. He plays up this big story about how salt is bad for you, the science is a lie. You actually need more salt. More salt is healthy. Your body gets stressed out if it's on too little salt. Here's a good supplement to buy if you need more salt. And the more people that click his link and use his code, the more money he gets directly. The more he scares you, the more he makes you worry about not getting enough sodium in your diet, the more money he makes. Disregarding the ad, the video is slimy, shady, just pushing a contra narrative for clicks and views. But when you add on top this massive conflict of interest, it just feels very malicious. Like he doesn't care about you or me, he just kind of cares about getting more money, crafting the perfect narrative to make as much money as physically possible. Because after all, a good story sells. There's a few takeaways you can have from this. One is to cite your sources. We were told so often in school to cite your sources, and the fact that I had to go on a hunt and search for all of his links seems a little inexcusable, especially when it's very easy just to plop them down in the description. Like he must have all these links saved somewhere on his computer, or at the very least put in like the corner of the screen, like something I could Google to get the exact thing you're looking at right now or the exact thing you're quoting from right now. But we don't get either of that. That's a really big red flag to me. Two, when reading studies, just stick to the abstract, conclusion, and maybe discussion if it's there. This is where the researcher will put all the important information, and it's probably more readable than the rest of the study. The main reason for this is that people that conduct studies are usually pretty smart, have a PhD, or a certain expertise in a certain field, and have spent a lot of time with the study, the data, and the participants in the study, knowing every detail and figuring out the best ways to interpret all this data, and in turn, figuring out what conclusions to draw from it all. Trying to come up with your own conclusions or using the data for your own ends is just sloppy, wrong, and just very arrogant. It's like saying, I know better than researchers, I know their own data better than them, when you probably don't. The third is sometimes life is just as boring as we think. The original point of Joseph's video was to show that health orgs and science was all lying to us. It was this big conspiracy with no data or evidence to back it up, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Most of the time, if a lot of different orgs from all around the world come to some sort of agreement, that thing is probably true. This can feel just like a blanket appeal to authority to get rid of any dissent, but let me put it this way. If there was evidence and a lot of data that showed a high salt diet was good for you, there'd be some country somewhere implementing this for their citizens, and their policies would try to increase the amount of sodium their citizens are eating because it would be healthier for them. But I don't think really any country does this. And he cited Korea, but that's not necessarily like their goals. That's just kind of what they eat. It was pretty disappointing to see a YouTuber who I thought made good videos and made me rethink things and gave me new perspective on a lot of issues could be using data and studies to manipulate and lie and just make more money. And don't let my video or his video guide you into what's true and not true. Knowing what's real and forming your own opinions has never been harder, while at the same time never been this easy. Do some research on your own, which means actually reading studies from accredited journals or talking to experts in their fields. Science, when we think is best practice, can change. This whole thing has always been an ever-evolving process. And instead of trying to shortcut it and find the best guaranteed thing right now, just take it as it is, knowing the future it might find something better than it is right now. This video is a lot longer than I usually do, as well as a different kind of video I'd normally make. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.